Right, so Israel has discovered a brand new axis of evil. Not content with Iran as the eternal bogeyman, another mad Israeli minister, this time in the form of Amichai Chikli, has decided to expand the franchise, naming Qatar, Syria, and Turkey as the new existential villains to Israel's existence. It'd be funny if it weren't so deadly serious. Qatar, bombed in its own capital by Israel while hosting peace talks, is now recast as a secret terror sponsor. Syria, already in ruins after the fall of Assad, not to mention the new rule by an al-Qaeda cast-off, is still being pummeled by Israel as if inflicting further instability on other nations is Israel's birthright. And Turkey, the supplier of nearly half of Israel's oil, is suddenly plotting a neo-Ottoman imperial return with Jerusalem in its sights, no less. This is not foreign policy, it is just a show of how absolutely deranged Israeli government figures are, a desperate attempt to turn every critic now into Iran 2.0 and to restore their victim status. The trouble for Israel is that the mask has slipped, their performances no longer convince, and there is zero likelihood of that ever changing again. Right, so it does take a special kind of arrogance to stand on a stage at a diplomatic conference and announce that you have discovered a brand new axis of evil. But ludicrous degrees of arrogance is something Israeli elected officials seem to have in spades. This is exactly what Amichai Chikli, Israel's Minister for Diaspora Affairs and Combating Antisemitism, did at the recent Jerusalem Post diplomatic conference. Before ambassadors and journalists and with the world watching, he declared that Qatar, Syria and Turkey now formed the new axis of evil. And in case anyone missed the point, he added that this was the new Iran. Chikli accused Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of plotting a neo-Ottoman vision, supposedly dreaming of resurrecting an empire that would swallow Jerusalem. He claimed Erdogan openly calls for Israel's annihilation. He portrayed Syria not as a country still crawling from the ruins of civil war, but as a fully-fledged extension of Iran itself, even though the new de facto and unelected leader of that nation, al-Sharaa, deposed the actual Iranian ally in Bashar al-Assad. And he turned to Qatar, a state that has mediated talks, hosted ceasefire negotiations, and got bombed by Israel for its trouble, into a masked villain, a terror sponsor, pretending to be a broker. The phrase axis of evil was not pulled out of thin air, of course. George W. Bush minted the term back in 2002, lumping together Iran, Iraq, and North Korea to prepare the ground for the invasion of Iraq. It was never analysis, it was always propaganda. It's a media headline term, a way of collapsing differences, of turning three very different states as they were into one monstrous enemy. It was designed to frighten the public and grant a blank check for war. So when Chikli drags the phrase back up and reframes it to fit his new narrative, it's not clumsy rhetoric, it's quite deliberate. It's an attempt to recycle a weaponized phrase to justify more acts of aggression, sabotage peace, and portray critics as existential threats. But here's the question. Has Israel actually pointed to its next targets by naming Qatar, Syria and Turkey in this way? Or is this the tantrum of a state losing its grip, a government whose excuses are crumbling, whose mask is slipping, and whose propaganda no longer convinces anybody of rational mind? Because this is not just about enemies, it's about stories. Israel has always survived on the power of a story, to spin a tale. The story of being a small democracy surrounded by vicious enemies who want to destroy it. The story of Iran as the master villain. The story of peace as something Israel yearns for, but all the Arabs refuse. Those stories worked for decades, didn't they? They made Western publics sympathetic. They kept the aid and the weapons flowing. They allowed Israel to act with impunity, cloaked in victimhood. But what happens when those stories finally collapse as they now have? What happens when the mask falls and the world sees not a plucky democracy, but a nuclear-armed occupier bombing mediators, sabotaging peace and starving civilians, committing genocide? That's the context of Chikli's speech, isn't it? And that's why his words feel less like strategy and more like a desperate howl. Take Qatar. For years, Israel tolerated Doha as a necessary nuisance, really. The Qataris hosted Hamas's political bureau. They funneled money into Gaza, paying civil servants and buying fuel. People too easily forget that Hamas are the elected administration of Gaza, and aid was provided for the politics to be made possible despite the Israeli blockade. That aid, rather awkwardly, was often coordinated with Israel itself, though, because Tel Aviv preferred Qatar to be footing the bill for keeping Gaza on life support and not paying it themselves. The arrangement might have been uncomfortable to some of them, but it was useful. But it also positioned Qatar well as mediators, as it had positive relations with both sides of this arrangement. But the arrangement collapsed in practice on October the 7th, 2023. But the minute Israeli missiles hit Doha during ceasefire talks recently, attempting to assassinate Hamas negotiators in the Qatari capital itself, Israel burned its bridges to the ground. This was no border strike, no battlefield clash. It was an assassination attempt at the heart of diplomacy in an erstwhile ally's capital. Qatar's government obviously raged about that, didn't they? Its foreign ministry declared that Israel's prime minister had committed a blatant violation of international law and promised such crimes would not go unpunished. Israel had not struck Hamas tunnels, they struck the negotiating table. Then came Egypt's revelation on the back of that. Cairo had claimed that it had foiled a parallel Israeli plot on its own soil, targeting Hamas negotiators there. 2 capitals, 2 sets of talks, 2 mediators, and both marked for sabotage by Israel. So why now brand Qatar as part of an axis of evil then? Because bombing a mediator looks indefensible, because it is. Unless you can say the mediator never really was a mediator, that it was always something like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Hamas financier, secret member of the new Iran. That's the trick, isn't it? Chikli's rhetoric rewrites the fact that, after the fact, Israel did not sabotage peace, it struck an enemy disguised as a broker. But outside that bubble, the excuses collapse. They are so used to their words being carried as fact no matter how mad, they still miss the fact that this is no longer the case. At an emergency session of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Iran's ambassador Ali Bayraini condemned Israel's attack on Qatar and warned that such aggression threatened not only the region, but global stability itself. Qatar, of course, demanded accountability. Sovereignty is being violated, hasn't it? The world saw what Israel wanted to obscure, a state that dared to host the talks were bombed and its neutrality was destroyed. And that is why this is a bigger story than just about Hamas. Israel is not just targeting militants, it's targeting mediation as well. So the lesson the world is learning as a result is that no Arab capital can play host to negotiations unless Israel approves of it. Qatar, by being branded axis of evil, is now being permanently blacklisted as a mediator. This is not just a strike against an enemy, it's a strike against the very infrastructure for peace. Israel absolutely do not want peace, so how can you negotiate with that? Negotiations have to begin at a position of some common ground, don't they? But there is none here. Not when peace is off the table from the very get-go. Now Syria. If Qatar has been recast into an enemy to cover sabotage, Syria has been Israel's eternal target. For over a decade, Israel has launched hundreds of strikes inside Syrian territory. Damascus airport, Aleppo airport, warehouses, convoys, military sites, all hit. Civilians killed, soldiers buried, sovereignty shredded. The Golan Heights still illegally held by Israel. Always with the same excuse, though. These are Iranian supply lines to Hezbollah and Lebanon. Always cloaked in the language of prevention. But the reality is starker than that. Israel is now actively arming thousands of Druze fighters in southern Syria, aiding them in defending themselves against their new unelected president who has done nothing but target minorities since claiming power. But all despite that leader, desperately wanting to ally himself to Israel at the same time. So this is not about stopping weapons shipments, it's about carving out influence, destabilizing the south, ensuring Syria never gets to recover, is never allowed to. It's a continuation of an old pattern. Before the fall of Assad, the very groups now running Syria that Israel is arming groups against, Israel was supplying aid to. The very jihadist-linked former al-Qaeda factions that brought Assad down benefited from Israeli aid until they had outlived their usefulness. It was not about building peace, it was about bleeding Syria dry. One leader down, another in place, but the destabilization must continue. So when Chikli calls Syria part of this new axis of evil, he's not identifying a new danger, he's admitting what Israel has long pursued: permanent destabilization of neighbouring states. Syria is not to be rebuilt, not to be normalised, not to be a neighbour with which peace is possible. It must remain weak, fractured and endlessly bombable. The excuse is crumbling here as well, though, because Israel's safety has been defined as someone else's permanent instability. Syria's past overtures are buried, what remains is rubble, and a state rebranded as Iran in miniature. And then it's Turkey. This is where the whole Axis charade tips into absolute absurdity. Because Turkey, whatever Erdogan says, is not just another critic, it's one of Israel's major lifelines. Around 40% of Israel's oil imports flow through Turkey's port of Ceyhan. Israeli and Turkish companies trade goods, energy and technology. Even at the height of shouting matches, the oil tankers keep on docking at Ashdod. Erdogan is loud, but he's a two-faced fraud. He's called Israel's campaign in Gaza genocide. He's declared Jerusalem a Muslim city. He hosts Hamas officials. At the United Nations, he casts himself as the voice of the Muslim world. But his words are not tanks rolling across a border. His threats are not blockades on oil shipments. They are speeches as the oil tankers keep on running. So how does Israel square this contradiction with itself then? Chikli's answer is ideology. Erdogan, he says, dreams of a neo-Ottoman empire with Jerusalem inside it. He claims Erdogan has openly called for Israel's annihilation. In Chikli's framing, genocide accusations become annihilationist threats, rhetoric become war plans, speeches become existential danger. But this explanation falls apart the moment you hold it up. Neo-Ottomanism in Turkish politics is about influence and trade and soft power, regional posturing. It's not about marching into Jerusalem with janissaries. Erdogan's talk of genocide is a moral charge, not a military blueprint. By inflating it into a plan for Israel's destruction, Chikli is repeating the same move Israel has used for years with Iran. Turn rhetoric into the apocalypse, criticism into casus belli. The problem is that this time the mask slips too easily. In fact, it's slipped, it's gone, hasn't it? There is no mask left, is there? You cannot buy nearly half your fuel from a state and insist it is plotting your annihilation. You cannot run oil pipelines through your supposed existential foe and keep a straight face while crying, axis of evil! People aren't that stupid, surely, and they take Israel's words with bigger and bigger grains of salt these days. That's why Turkey's inclusion feels really desperate. Qatar can be demonised for hosting Hamas. Syria can be demonised for housing Hezbollah supply lines and being led by an al-Qaeda leftover. But Turkey, a NATO member and Israel's oil supplier, is harder to fit into that box. Yet Chikli squeezes it in anyway, stretching Erdogan's speeches into proof of an empire-building plan. The lunacy is obvious, and the desperation really should be plain to see as well. When you step back, the pattern is a familiar one. It's a very old, very boring, samey story now, isn't it? Israel has moved from pointing to one great villain in Iran to inflating every critic into a new version of Iran. Qatar is not a mediator, it's a terror sponsor. Syria is not a broken neighbour, it's an Iranian corridor still. Turkey is not a trading partner, it's an empire builder with Jerusalem in its sights. But this is not strategy, it's an attempt to keep that old, boring story alive after it has long fallen apart. For decades, Israel's propaganda rested on a single figure, Iran as the existential threat and the mastermind behind everything. Everything can be justified in relation to Iran. Strikes in Syria, stopping Iran. Assassinations in Lebanon, stopping Iran. Lobbying in Washington, containing Iran. The story was clean, it was coherent, it's easy to sell. It became very familiar to all of us in the West after decades of Iran being labelled this boogeyman that we should all be afraid of. But that story's collapsed. Western publics now see Gaza not as a battlefield but as a genocide. The International Court of Justice has accused Israel of committing the crime of crimes, as has the UN now. The International Criminal Court is pursuing warrants for war crimes. Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, once cautious, even complicit, are now openly accusing Israel of sabotage and aggression. Western allies whisper doubts about arms sales. The excuse of self-defense against annihilation no longer works when mediators get bombed, aid is blocked, and starvation is used as a weapon. That is the backdrop to Chikli's speech. His axis of evil line is not the confident naming of new enemies, it's a desperate, sad, pathetic bid to stretch the old Iranian playbook across every one of its critics now. Inflate rhetoric into danger, turn condemnation into existential threat, justify whatever comes next. Please feel sorry for Israel, the world's eternal victims. But the trick's breaking down, the excuses are crumbling, and the mask, as I said, is gone. So has Israel identified its next targets in this? Well, on one level, yes. It's already acted, hasn't it? It bombed Doha. It plotted in Cairo. It batters Syria on a daily basis and now arms militias there. It demonises Erdogan even as it takes his oil. Chikli's speech merely gives a name to what is already happening, but also reminds us of exactly what Israel is actually doing. So all he deserves is abject condemnation, and he can shove his desperation for sympathy where the sun doesn't shine. But on another level, no, this is not a coherent strategy either. It's flailing. Israel is flailing again. It's the screaming of a state losing its grip, multiplying enemies because its story's collapsed. The danger, of course, is that words like these can harden into actions. Bush's axis of evil speech set the stage for Iraq, and we all know what came next. If Israel insists on treating Qatar, Syria and Turkey as annihilationist enemies, it may enact against them as though that fiction were real. We know they're capable, we know they're desperate given how many fronts are already fighting, and we know the US will keep arming them. Yet even if it does not turn into further action, one thing's already clear. Israeli propaganda no longer convinces. The excuses no longer hold. Israel has not mapped its future with this speech. It's revealed its present, a state lashing out at mediators and neighbours and suppliers alike because the old mask has fallen and the world can finally see what lies beneath it. And it is ugly, and it is depraved, and it must be opposed. Certainly a great deal of that is being reflected in Israel's economy right now too, because as much as Amichai Chikli might be seen now to have been putting his foot in it, so was Netanyahu. Only his words just tanked Israel's economy rather badly, and the investors are now fleeing. To get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here is your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.